I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight, Ethan Tapper. So, Ethan is a forester, a digital creator, and a best-selling author, spreading a message of relationship, responsibility, and hope with regard to forestry and ecological stewardship. And through his writing, online engagement, and in-person events, Ethan reaches millions of people each year and gets them thinking about important questions related to our role and responsibility as humans in a changing world. He asks questions like, how do we use our species' incredible power to heal rather than harm? So I'm really excited to hear Ethan's perspective on stewardship, partially because I've always struggled with this idea that the human world and the natural world are separate things, and I'm excited to hear about the ways that Ethan approaches and maybe dismantles that duality of humans and nature. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to you, Ethan.
Hey everybody. So I'm tuning in here from about as far away from Bridger as I could be and still be in this country, on this continent, from Vermont. And you may not know it for all you West Coast folks out there, but for an early riser like me, this is past my bedtime. How to Love a Forest After Hours, which is how, it's 9 o'clock here, and I'm going to stay up a little late just to hang out with you guys out there on the West Coast a little bit. So, as Bridger mentioned, my name's Ethan Tapper, and what I'm really trained in is to be a forester. We can talk about what that means, but essentially what it is these people who are specifically trained to kind of like negotiate the relationship between people and these incredibly complex and beautiful ecosystems that we call a forest, right? Here in the eastern United States, a lot of the foresters do what I do, which is we are consulting foresters, which means we're private foresters and we work for private landowners. Those of you on the West Coast might not know that in the eastern United States, about 80% of our forests are privately owned. So it's almost the inverse as it is in the Western US, which just means that all of these ecosystems, these forests that are totally essential to our lives and to our quality of life, that are providing clean air and clean water and wildlife habitat and making our world beautiful and providing all of these different incredible and irreplaceable and precious values, 80% of them are just owned by people, right? And they don't have to necessarily have a degree in forestry or biology or ecology, and they don't have to, pass a test. They don't have to have any competencies. They just are forest landowners. And so what us foresters do is help people like figure out how to take care of those forests. Another thing that I should say too is the differences between forestry here, forests and forestry here and where you are don't end there. Our forest types are completely different, right? They have some things in common, but different tree species growing in different ways. And then the culture that surrounds them is also really different. And so I think, what I hope you come away with from this talk is not maybe necessarily like the individual, like specific deep knowledge that can come from someone who's been working in your region for a long time and developed a really, a level of deep knowledge, deep understanding of your forests, but generally like of these ecosystems in general is what I want to talk about, and how we think about our relationship to them. And in that respect, we have a lot in common. So I want to say that like with my own journey, started as being a forester, and there started to be like some stuff that I wanted to talk about. And I decided somehow that I wanted to start to actually write about it. And I'd never written a book before. I'm not trained as a writer. And I just realized at some point that I had this period of time, the first hour of my day, when my brain was working really well. And I used to like give that hour of my day to work. I'd be sending off a lot of emails and like doing a lot of work stuff really efficiently. And I was like, what if I just kept this hour all to myself? And so I started taking this hour, which for me is 5 to 6 in the morning. And I was just writing for an hour every day about the stuff that I wanted to talk about. And it wasn't like I was trying to write a book. I didn't think that I was capable of writing a book. And in retrospect, now I think that the fact that I wasn't really trying to write a book, that I was just trying to write for an hour, was what actually allowed me to write a book. Because if I was like, I'm going to go out and write a book, I definitely would have never started. It would have been too scary, too intimidating. No way. But I could write for an hour. And what it felt like now is, when I think back on that time, is just like every day, I was just taking like a little stone and, I just open my back door and just chuck it back there, making this gesture that by itself is totally insignificant, completely meaningless. And then you just do it again and again and again and again and again. And one day you look back there and you're like, that pile's getting pretty big. And so I did this process of writing every day for an hour, which became, more of like a practice than anything else, or it was just a lovely way to start my day, drinking my coffee, writing on the laptop, tap, tap, tap for an hour. And then 6 o'clock comes around, I close the laptop, go work in the woods. I did that every day for 6 years. And then I found a publisher, wanted to publish the book, signed to a contract. And I said, this thing's going to be out by the end of the week. And they said, your publication date's in 2 years. And that brought us to September of last year, 2024. And there's, at the same time that the book was sort of taking shape, there was this parallel process taking shape, which if you've been involved with the stewardship of ecosystems, you will understand this process, which is the process of doing another incremental and sometimes seemingly insignificant series of actions, which is what we do to take care of these ecosystems. So in 2017, I became the owner of this forest that I've named Bear Island, and which is throughout the book. And when I became the owner of this forest, it was messed up. And I really saw it as a forest that had every problem that a forest could have, sort of this symbol of everything that was wrong with the world. And I didn't, even though I worked as a consulting forester and then as a service forester, which is like a forester that works for a public agency, in my case, for my state Department of Forestry, I didn't know how to like heal this forest and keep it from collapsing. So I just did the same thing, right? Like didn't try to heal it all at once. And if I had tried to, I probably would have never even started because it would have been too intimidating, too scary, too much. And I just did what I could with the time that I had and the resources that I had, energy that I had at my disposal. And as I was seeing this book that became How to Love a Forest take shape, I was also seeing this forest, Bear Island, change. And 8 years later, become this forest that I really saw as, go from being a forest that I saw as being a forest that was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the world, to being this forest that to me is a symbol of hope and a symbol of what's possible if we're willing to engage deeply with our ecosystems and to do the actions that are necessary to protect them. So one of the things that I think is a very challenging and tricky thing to wrap our head around is this idea of what it means to protect a forest. We have this idea that maybe if we conserve a forest with a conservation easement, or if it becomes publicly owned, becomes protected in some way, that we've done our job, right? We did it. And that's an understanding that those are really important things. And that's an understanding that works really well when you understand forests a little bit. And then of course, when you invest your life in the ecology of these ecosystems and how they work and all of this biodiversity, all of these trillions of organisms that may depend on a single forest, you start to realize that what it means to actually protect a forest is a lot more complicated. So I had this, and I want to talk about this concept of stewardship, which is one of my favorite words. I had this realization this spring, as I'm working on Bear Island. Every year it's like you're doing more stuff and solving new problems. And one of the things that I did for myself at Bear Island is, in this little open area, I planted an orchard. And every year I was like, I'm going to budget $300 and I'm going to buy bare root, weird heirloom apple varieties from this company in Maine called Fedco. And I'm going to plant them in this orchard. And it's, one tree at a time, a few trees at a time. And I planted them and planted them and planted them, and eventually realized, sort of by accident, that I had planted an orchard with 100 trees in it. And I was taking care of them. I was pruning them and then training them and mulching them and weeding them and watering them and fertilizing them this spring. And I had this realization where I was like, oh, planting a tree is the easiest part. And that actually the real work, that's when the work begins. The real work is then to stay and to tend the trees that you've planted. Every year those trees get bigger, right? Every year there's more for me to prune, and their trunks are thicker, and their crowns are bigger, and it's more work. And eventually I'm going to have to deal with the fruit, which I have no idea how I'm going to do that. But every year I have to still be there, right? And to engage in this process of stewardship, which is this ongoing process that lasts forever. And one of the things that's really hard about our relationship with ecosystems is we have to develop a more complex sense of what they need from us in this moment. And to even understand that something like stewardship, the process by which we care for these forests, can be just as important as our sense that we've protected them. That the process of caring for that tree, for that forest, is just as important as planting it. So I want to do a couple of readings from the book. The first one that I want to read is from the introduction. And it sort of describes just why I wrote the book in the first place. Once it seemed that there were only two paths to follow: a status quo that saw forests and other ecosystems as commodities, and an opposing force that sought to protect ecosystems from ourselves, to leave them alone. As forests everywhere struggle under the weight of the many threats and the stressors of the modern world, as they suffer the legacies of the past and confront a future that promises challenges like never before, I have realized that neither of these two paths is enough. I've realized that the world needs action intertwined with compassion, relationship imbued with responsibility, death infused with life. I have gone my own way, fostering a divergent vision, a reimagining of what it means to love a forest, engaging in the radical act of trading simplicity for complexity, trading a tidy vision for one that is true. My journey toward these realizations has been long and lonely and sinuous. In my little house at the foot of the mountain, my bookshelf is crowded with books about trees and plants and animals, birds and bears and fungi, the relationship between people and ecosystems, and the threats both face. Never have I found a book that has articulated what a forest truly is, not just its botany and its biology, the contours of its many pieces and its parts, but how this entire living community moves and behaves and changes. Never have I found a book that described what it means to care for a forest like Bear Island, an ecosystem that has been changed and degraded and depleted and left to suffer alone. Never have I found a book that described the pain and the joy and the anxiety of trying to love and protect an ecosystem, of guiding it toward wholeness at this strange and crucial moment in time. No book has prepared me for the many complex and bittersweet choices that I would someday make at Bear Island, or for the fact that these actions would be celebrations, the substance of a truly radical and responsible relationship with the forest. In this book, I draw these disparate threads together, exploring what it means to love a forest in this changed and changing world. It is a new land ethic, a vision of relationship and responsibility, freedom and power, resilience and humility, legacy, beauty, and change. In a world that is both human and wild, both wounded and vibrant, both suppressed and emergent, this is a vision both for how we manage forests and take care of ecosystems, and how we manage ourselves, how we take care of each other. One of the big questions that I ask in this book is not just sort of asking you all, its readers, I hope, to sort of think about forests in a more complex way and in a more granular way, really thinking about what a forest is, what it means for it to work, what it means for it to be healthy, what they need from us in order to thrive. If we allow ourselves to sort of like set aside the thing that, as Bridger mentioned, this like idea that we have about like that humans must be over here and nature over here, but to like also ask a broader question, which is, how do we actually live here in this world? We have this funny thing where we kind of like want it all, you know, where we want to have this abundance. We want to have all the things that we need to live. And we want to have all this stuff and we want to have all this opportunity. We want to give all these things to our children, right? And to future generations of people. We want them to live in a world that's more abundant, that's more full of life and more full of opportunity. And at the same time, we want to have this thing that we call nature be totally fine and not have to do anything for them and just be able to continue to receive all these benefits from them. And it is a tragedy, really, and a bummer that these ecosystems are like really complicated, and how they've been managed in the past has really affected them, and how, you know, in this moment they're carrying these tremendous legacies of the past, right? How they've been managed. They're dealing with a volume of threats and stressors such that they have maybe never seen, on an order of magnitude that may be completely unprecedented, and moving into a future that promises more of those changes and challenges than ever before, right? They're not okay. They don't have the ability to just weather any storm and continue to be this thing as we recognize this, you know, beautiful ecosystem. And that provides us with the ability to like live on this beautiful and abundant planet. And I wanted to sort of like tell this story about not just how beautiful forests are, but how beautiful it is to think about really like stepping into relationship with those forests and doing the things that are necessary to protect them, even when it's stuff that's kind of hard to wrap our head around. So the classic example that I talk about in this book is, how could it be that we could love a forest and change a forest, love trees and cut trees? How could it be that these two things can exist at the same time? But actually, what it turns out is that if we're doing these things in the right way, you know, managing forests, even cutting trees, that they can be these profound gifts to these ecosystems that have been so altered and so degraded by how they've been managed in the past. So I want to tell you a story. It's my story, and illustrates, I think, a journey that a lot of us need to go on, and also a journey that we get to go on, that we have the privilege to get to go on. So when I was growing up, I was not a kid who was interested in nature at all. You know, I read these stories about all these people who they're foresters, the biologists, they're ecologists, you know, some of my heroes, nature writers, and they always knew that this is what they wanted to do, and this is what they were interested in, and this is what they're going to dedicate their lives to. And if you didn't have a childhood like that, you know, there's still time, because I certainly didn't. I grew up in this little rural village in southeastern Vermont called Saxton's River, which was surrounded by forests, but I had no interest in them, no interest in working in them at all. And I actually remember telling somebody what I really wanted to do was get out of there, right? I wanted to go do something else, go live in a city or something, I don't know. And I remember telling someone my junior year of high school, I said, I don't know where I'm going to go to college, but I know where I'm not going to go. And that's the University of Vermont. Because here it just seems like everybody goes there and it's this big cop out. Ended up the first month of my senior year of high school, I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that I got this scholarship called the Green and Gold Scholarship, which is a full scholarship. And I was like, I guess I'm going to the University of Vermont. But even once I got there, so I went. Even once I got there, though, I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I was taking all these random classes. And what happened was that I was still dating my high school girlfriend, first big love of my life. And she had decided she wanted to go on this wilderness expedition with this program. And when she came back, it was 5 months long. When she came back, I was finishing up my second semester of college, and she had had this huge, like, life-changing experience. And I had not. I'd just been hanging out in my dorm room doing whatever 19-year-olds do in college. And we weren't connecting, and it was freaking me out. And I thought we were going to break up. And so I said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go on a wilderness expedition. Like any perfectly reasonable, rational 19-year-old, I said, when's the next wilderness expedition? I left in 2 weeks, and it was a 6-month expedition where we skied north for 3 months, built a canoe, and canoed back down. Now, in retrospect, I did this for no reason. The relationship didn't work out, but it totally changed the course of my life. And after that, all I wanted to do was just be in the woods. And I ended up working as a wilderness guide. I lived in this uninsulated yurt in the woods of Maine with a fir bough floor for a year. I worked with draft animals, did a little bit of draft horse logging. And then I got a letter from the University of Vermont that told me that I had to come back or I was going to lose my scholarship. And I remember holding a paper list of all the majors at the University of Vermont. And I scrolled down and I saw forestry. And I didn't know what it was, but it had the word forest in it. So I said, we'll try that. Now, I had been living in the woods, in a very close relationship with these ecosystems. And I thought that I had those places all figured out, right? I thought that I understood forests completely and understood really like the only responsible relationship that we could have with them. And my experience of going to forestry school was pretty jarring. You know, I walked in there all, like I'll show these people about forests. And when I started to take these classes, I started to study biology and ecology and dendrology and natural history, all these different things. I started to realize that I actually didn't understand forests that well at all. And the process, what I now see it, what I saw it as in the moment it was like something was being taken away from me. That somehow these forests that I had just seen as these like perfect, pristine, utopian places weren't that way for me anymore. That suddenly I couldn't not see that the forests that we have today are the product of all of these tremendous legacies. So in the case of here in the Northeast, basically every forest anyone who lives here has ever been in was an agricultural field within the last 100 years. It's this remarkable, history that is pervasive and hidden and secret to most of us. And the forests that we have today on our landscape are really young, really simple, lacking almost all of the qualities that defined what it meant to be a forest on this landscape for thousands of years. And, as they've been recovering, they've been dealing with all these other issues, like almost across this continent, deer overpopulation, right? Of white-tailed deer, which can really inhibit the forest's ability to regenerate. It can only regenerate some species that deer don't like to eat. Dealing with things like these introduced plant species, what we call the invasive plants that were introduced by people and are hyper-virulent, hyper-competitive, outcompete all of our native species and create these monocultures that don't have any of these really amazing evolutionary adaptations and relationships with our native species of insects and other organisms. The list goes on. And suddenly, I couldn't walk through forests and not see all of that stuff. So at first it felt like something was being taken away from me. It was very jarring. And now what I really see was happening was this process of what I call deepening, right? So for most people who love forests, they know a little bit about them. They maybe know a few different tree species, and they walk through the forest and they see those green leaves, they see those green needles, they see those beautiful trees, and they're like, good, this is good. This is a beautiful forest. And sometimes what's necessary for us is to go a little deeper and to see what's really going on. And, what I saw was that, yes, these forests were still beautiful, still precious, still worthy of our respect, and worth saving, but also that they were dealing with all these very real problems. And I started to realize that deepening, which also comes, by the way, with all of these wonders, understanding forests more deeply is not just a painful process, it's also a joyful process, because you start to see more stuff. And you start to see all of these incredible different species of trees and plants and animals, birds and fungi, and all of these different things that make up this forest community. You see so much more, you hear so much more, you perceive so much more. And it also allows you to have a better understanding of like where these forests are at and the help that they need from us. So in this vein of deepening, I want to do another reading from the book. And this reading is from the first chapter, which is about reimagining forests. And it talks about how I'm like walking through my orchard and pruning my trees and juxtaposing this sort of like orderly, tidy, managed system with the much more wild forest around it. Hold on one second. Oop, that's why I grabbed the wrong book. I'm having like an identity crisis. I was like, where's my bookmark? Okay. And in this, by the way, I'm also a birder, and this is where I also reveal myself as such. A group of chickadees visits me, flitting from fence to fence. I pause to watch their circus. As my pruning shears quiet, I hear nuthatches and dark-eyed juncos, the pounding of a pileated woodpecker on an aspen. As I've learned to recognize more of the forest's birds, a cacophony has become a chorus. Each species of bird calls its own name. Each touches the forest in a different way, each finding habitat within different pieces and parts of this living community. Each is unique. A decade ago, I looked into the forest and saw faceless trees, each like the others. As I learned to tell sugar maple from red maple, the flat needles of hemlock from the angular needles of spruce, the peeling bark of paper birch from the creamy bark of aspen, the forest has become a creature of diversity and complexity and depth. Each tree species is habitat for different birds, insects, and mammals, each growing on different sites and in different ways, each flourishing different flowers and bearing different fruits. Each is precious. Once I saw forests as no different from orchards. I've since learned to reimagine the forest as something messy and imperfect, complex and undefinable, dynamic and expansive over space and time. I've learned to see the trees in the forest as a coral in a coral reef, the living structure at the center of a community of boundless depth and diversity. I've learned that an understanding of what healthy forests look like, how they work, and what it means to take care of them is not something that any of us are born with. It is something that we need to develop. I've learned that forests are not supposed to be pleasant or understandable or beautiful to us. They are what they are, and it is up to us to meet them there. Now, when I look into the forest, I see kaleidoscopes of interactions and connections, critical pieces and parts as diminutive as a bed of moss on a rotting log, and as massive as a mountain, a region, a continent, a biosphere. Now I see that the fungi and the bacteria of the soil, the insects, the mosses and the lichens, the beech and the oak, the deer and the owls and the bears, these things do not live in the forest. They are the forest. The windstorms and the ice storms, the forest fires and the floods, the death and the change, these things do not happen to the forest. They are the forest. Once, I thought that being a forester meant being a caretaker of trees. Now I see myself as the caretaker of a reimagined forest, the steward of every piece of this incredible volume of life. So there's this thing that happens to you when you learn to identify these different species of trees, which is that you go from seeing trees trees to seeing that there are all these individual trees which are totally different, right? And then you learn about those species of trees and they start to tell you stuff about what's happened to the forest, about what kind of a forest this is, about where it's going. And the thing that has been really shocking for me as over the last couple of years, I've become a birder. See, I'm just instinctively pointing to my ear because I listen for birds, is realizing that my whole life, I have just completely ignored this wonder of the world that is these birds. I had the experience this summer of going back to Saxon's River, this little village I grew up in, because my mom wanted me to do a talk at this like local community center that's there. And I was walking there from my mom's house, and I was like, chimney swifts. There were chimney swifts hunting all over the town. Chimney swifts are this remarkable bird that totally unique. We call it, it's not a traditionally good looking bird, but it is a very beautiful bird. We call it the flying cigar, the cigar with wings. There are these voracious aerial insectivores that can basically never stop flying. They can actually turn off half their brain so they can sleep while they're flying. And every day they fly 8,000 feet up in the air. And people don't know exactly why, but one of the reasons might be because from that height, you can watch weather fronts approaching. So they could be going to see what the weather's going to be like tomorrow. And then they come spiraling down, often into these chimneys. So the chimney swift is actually an old growth bird. It used to be for thousands of years that they lived in these big hollow trees, and they actually roost like a bat on the interior of it, because they actually can only take off from a vertical position, not from a horizontal. They're really weird, but they're remarkable. There's so many cool things I could tell you about them. They can fit 1,000 insects in their mouth at one time. They're faster in straight line flight than a peregrine falcon. They can fly like 65 miles an hour. Incredible birds. And when they're hunting, they make these sweet little chirping sounds. They're making these social calls, these sweet little chirping sounds, and they're just darting over your head like this. And so I was walking to this talk I was giving at this town that I lived the whole first 18 years of my life. And I realized that my whole life I had been hearing and seeing chimney swifts, and also neither hearing nor seeing them, right? And they were there the whole time. And I thought about, one way of thinking about that is that for all the people who don't see the chimney swifts, don't hear the birds, don't see the trees in the forest, what a sad thing, right? What a missed opportunity. And also, what an opportunity, right? What an amazing world this is, that we have an opportunity to show these people all of these amazing, beautiful things that are right there. And part of that is just showing people the trees and the birds. And part of that is then bringing them with us and saying, okay, these birds, these trees, these forests are amazing. What are we going to do about that? What does it actually mean to care for these things? So like, as I become a birder, I hang out with birders all the time, who, by the way, all of the most compelling people on earth are birders, the best. And, a lot of the birders will say things like, a lot of them have been doing it a long time, a lot longer than I have. And they'll say things like, I used to be able to see this bird here and I don't anymore. I used to be able to see more of this bird and now I hardly ever see them. And that would be like the period, end of sentence. And for me, I would just sort of look at them and be like, well, what do we want to do about it? So there's a couple things that are really cool about forestry to me. One of them is that we study these whole ecosystems, these forests, which, are all of these different pieces and parts, rather than sort of like zoning in on one individual piece and part of the forest. So like in the natural resources, we get funneled into these tracks. So you can be like an entomologist, you can study insects, and you can be an ornithologist, you can study birds, you can be a botanist, you can study plants. And a forester is sort of responsible for all of those things and for no one of those things in particular. And that's, I think, fundamentally a better way to think about these ecosystems that belong to all of those different things, that actually you can't have each of those pieces and parts, the trees, the plants, the animals, birds, the bears, the fungi, they're all connected, right? And they all, you need all of them for any of them to exist, which is a very woo-woo-y thing to say, and which is also a biologically objective reality. Okay. And so, I think that's a fundamentally better way to look at forests. But the other part, which leads me back into this, what are we going to do about it, is that there's another really special thing about being a forester, which is that at its heart, forestry is a discipline of action. And imbued in us is this idea that we do not have to be bystanders in these ecosystems, that we can go into them and we can see what's going on, and then we can do something about it. And it's actually the most natural thing in the world. It's a thing that people have been doing on this landscape for thousands of years. When I'm being a little cheeky with my colleagues who are ornithologists or entomologists or botanists, I'll say something like, if you want someone to tell you all the different insects in your forest, call an entomologist. And if you want someone to tell you all the plants, call a botanist. And if you want someone to tell you all the birds, call an ornithologist. And if you want someone to do something about any of those things, you can call a forester. And that's something that has become a really important part of the way that I love forests, is that I love them as they are, and I don't stop there, right? I go deeper. And I say, what can I actually do to care for these ecosystems, which are not just important to me, which are intrinsically important, which are important to themselves. And so in that light, I want to tell another story, which is about my land, Bear Island. So the first time I heard about this piece of land, it was just this ad on this realtor's website, and I'd been helping other people manage their land for a while as a consulting forester and then as a service forester. And I had this sort of dream that one day I would have a forest of my own to take care of. And I saw this piece of land, and it was 175 acres for sale. And the listing was hilarious. It was like almost like, don't worry about that 175 acres. Put that out of your mind. Check out this view. And it was just a view of this mountain called Camel's Hump, which is like the currency of this whole area. Like everybody wants this view of Camel's Hump. And it was like, just build your mansion right here, and you can look at Camel's Hump, and that 175 acres, don't worry about it. And it was pretty cheap. And I was like, geez, what's wrong with it? And I went to go find out. My first impression, the first thing I saw when I got onto this land was that the truck road, the access road, hadn't been properly stabilized, and it was washed out. There was a ravine cutting right down the center. I had to straddle it with the wheels of the truck. I rolled up onto this log landing, that clearing that picture of Camel's Hump had been taken from, and it was covered in trash. Bags of household trash, cables and hoses and tires, busted pieces of equipment half buried in the ground. And going out from it in every direction, this network of these logging trails, skid trails, just bleeding murky water down the mountain with these 3-foot deep ruts. And it was not a great way to start. And I said, you know what? I'm already here. I'll go take a walk. And so I started to walk up this main trail, and it was incredibly steep, and I was getting covered in sweat, getting covered in ticks. And something started to bother me, and I couldn't put my finger on it. I didn't know what exactly it was. And I was walking. I was like, geez, what's bothering me? And I realized after about an hour that what was bothering me was that this was a forest with no healthy trees. Once I realized this, it was a very jarring thing to realize. And I started looking around like, that can't be right. I'd never seen a forest, no healthy trees in it. But sure enough, no healthy trees, no healthy trees, no healthy trees anywhere. What I now know happened is that 30 years before, the previous landowner had just told these loggers, cut every tree bigger than 10 inches in diameter on the mountain. So 10 inches in diameter, it's pretty small. And they had done it. And this is really what it was this thing that we call high grading, which is this process by which you go into the forest and you cut all of the most valuable high grade trees, and you leave the least valuable low grade trees standing there. It is the inverse, the opposite of what any responsible landowner or forester or logger would ever do. you're managing the forest to be less healthy as efficiently as possible. And I think there's an argument to be made that it would have been a greater kindness to this forest if they had just cut all the trees, because then at least it would have had a chance to regenerate a generation of trees that would have had an opportunity to be healthy. But as it was just kind of stuck. And so I kept on walking, and I found that even in places where they had cut most of the trees and the forest had an opportunity to regenerate, that all of those young trees were getting browsed to death by white-tailed deer. There was evidence of a deer overpopulation there as well. I dropped over this band of cliffs that bisect the land from west to east and right into a 30-acre infestation of this introduced plant species called Japanese barberry, very virulent, invasive introduced plant. Just waist-high barberry, pure, 30 acres. I'd never seen that before. A patch of it that was so dense and so expansive. No native plants. And I started pushing through this, barberry thicket. And I got back to my truck and I said, forget this place. I'm out of here. And I left. And, I was like, I'll go find some other forest that's easier to love. And sure enough, I kept tabs on it over the next couple months. I looked at it and it was still up there on the website, And I started to ask myself if that forest was actually hopeless or if there was something that I could do to help it. And after a couple of months, I convinced myself to go back. And by the time I went back, it was summer. And I started finding all this cool stuff. Started finding these plants that I love, sweet fern and lowbush blueberry and pink corydalis, red columbine, huckleberry, maple leaf viburnum. I started finding that there were actually some healthy trees there after all. They were just so hidden behind these masses of unhealthy trees that I hadn't seen them. And that there were these rock outcrops covered in reindeer moss with these sweeping views of the Winooski River Valley. And I was standing on one of those outcrops when I said to myself, I'm going to try and buy this place. And I didn't know how to do that. Never did anything like that before. And so I called up my old boss, Mike, who sold forest land real estate. And I said, Mike, there's this piece of land and I want to make an offer. And how much do I offer? How do I do this? And he said, well, let me ask you a few questions. Is there any timber on it? And I said, no. And he said, any real estate potential? And I said, no. Is the access good? No. Is there any sugar maple on it? Could it be a maple sugar bush? No. And we kept on going down the line. No. And eventually he said, well, Ethan, this place sounds terrible. Just offer them like nothing and don't be afraid of hurting their feelings. And that's how I became the owner of this piece of land, Bear Island. And I'll tell you what, it's one thing to think that all we got to do to take care of our ecosystems is just to leave them all alone, and this thing that we call nature will sort it out. And it's a really different thing when you're standing on that log landing on this piece of land that is no one's responsibility but yours, and you're looking at these piles of trash, in a forest with no healthy trees in it, climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, acres and acres and acres totally dominated by these introduced plants with a deer overpopulation, all of these different things happening at once, watching thousands of years of soil roll down the mountain through those skidder ruts. And I had to ask myself if it would be of greater kindness to this place to leave it alone, hope for the best, or to do everything in my power to try and make it healthy again. Now, we don't often realize this, but we are all of us standing on that log landing right now. Right? In this world that is wounded and that needs help, and that we have the power to help if we're willing to move beyond all of these ideas that we've built up about what our role in these ecosystems should be, and to really step into this responsibility that we have as caretakers of this abundant and precious and irreplaceable planet. Now, in the case of me, I decided to take action. And what I often say is that, in this effort to heal Bear Island, I have two superpowers. Superpower number one, ADHD, which used in the right way can be extremely powerful. Superpower number 2 is that I am not a purist. And so I could actually ask myself, what tools do we have to solve these problems? And I wish that I could tell you that all I had to do was just fill my pockets with wildflower seeds and just scatter them across the mountain, and it was beautiful and easy, and that's all we had to do. And it wasn't like that. It was much more like teaching myself to run an excavator and restoring those eroding skid trails and building new, more resilient trails, teaching myself to be a deer hunter, killing dozens of deer to try and lower that deer overpopulation that's such an existential threat to ecosystems here, cutting thousands of trees, finding each healthy tree that remained and cutting the less healthy trees that were competing with them, and where there are areas that were no healthy trees at all, cutting pockets of trees to allow a new generation to establish. And there's especially one thing that I do that there's a parody to that I really like, which is that I know that 30 years ago, these loggers came to this forest and they used these tools, right? They use these pieces of logging equipment we call skidders, specifically cable skidders, which are these skidders that have this like long cable winch on the back, long powerful winch on the back, made by this company Timberjack in the late 1970s, early 1980s. I know because I've dug pieces of those skidders up out of the ground in the clearing with the excavator. They use these Timberjack cable skidders and these chainsaws and created all these problems that I'm going to spend the rest of my life fixing. And now, as I heal Bear Island, 2 of my most powerful tools are my 1981 Timberjack cable skidder, his name is Red, and my chainsaw. There are so many things like this. These tools that used in one way can harm ecosystems, harm future generations of people, and used in another way can help them heal. And there's another thing that's like that, which is us. There is no doubt that we are the greatest threat to ecosystems. There is no doubt that we have caused every problem that they face. And I believe there is absolutely no doubt that we are their best hope for a better future. So one of the things that's been so remarkable in this story, and the fullness of this cannot even be captured in How to Love a Forest because it keeps on changing all the time, is watching this forest, Bear Island, become a beautiful and wonderful place. Again, really this symbol of what's possible and this symbol of hope. I walk through this forest with colleagues and friends, and they say, it's beautiful. What a beautiful, diverse young forest. And I say, I wish that you had walked here with me 7 years ago. And I wish I had taken a picture too, because you would have told me this was the most messed up forest you'd ever seen. There are things we can do, you know? And one of the most remarkable things has been seeing this forest that, you know, when I started this process, I was like, how am I going to bail out this boat? How am I going to stop the bleeding? How am I going to keep this ecosystem from collapsing? And what I've seen is not just this ecosystem not collapse, but this ecosystem really start to rediscover itself, rediscover its true capacity for life, and to become so much more. And it reminds me that when I think about what we're trying to build here and what we're trying to do, I am so uninterested in and so unexcited by the prospect of handing future generations a world that isn't any worse than the world of today. What I really want to do is to build a bigger world, a better world, a more beautiful world, a world that's more full of life, a world that's more abundant for both future generations of people and for everything that lives here. And we can do it. Honestly, we have the tools to solve many of these problems with existing resources, with existing technology. We just have to be willing to do so. We have to be willing to change. So I want to do one last reading. It's a longer one from the end of the book. And then I would be honored to take your questions. So if you have any questions that you've been thinking of or that come up, put them in the chat and we'll get to them after this. Thanks for listening. The storm clouds stamp their feet. They are corralled along the shifting path of the big river, thundering between the walls of the valley. The clouds move west, driven like cattle toward the mountains. As empty as it often feels, there is something beautiful about a life lived in the aftermath. Here, in the junkyard of the Anthropocene, we hold the fate of the world, all of its ecosystems, all of its peoples in our hands. In this moment, we can allow this biosphere, our home, to sink further into dysfunction and disarray, or we can make the radical and bittersweet decisions necessary to choose a different path. Inside of this catalyzing moment, we have the opportunity to reimagine our relationship to ecosystems and our relationship to each other, to redefine what we are and what is precious to us. As empty as they often feel, there is something beautiful about a landscape of forests that are just a fraction of their true potential. The forests of our lives are still only at the beginning of their journeys. They may yet become diverse and complex, rich with legacies, ancient again. With our help, these forests may rediscover a capacity for life beyond imagining, an abundance that this world has not known for generations. I pick up another acorn, another product of thousands of years of adaptation and change, another precious thing chained to the legacies of the past and hurtling toward an uncertain future. Perhaps it is doomed. Perhaps it contains endless possibilities. Humidity cloaks the land, drawing tiny round beads of sweat from my skin. For a moment, the mountain is cast in golden light. It smells sharp and strong. As I touch another acorn, a raindrop strikes the back of my hand, rolling between the small bones of my fingers. Suddenly, droplets are stippling the soil like falling stars, throwing up little clouds of dust. I have nowhere to be, and so I kneel, watching the water run around the stumps and the upturned leaves, drawing spider webs on the earth. Someday, I will tell my children that the caves in the talus above are a womb, the origin of all the black bears on the mountain, and that the springs in the big bowl are the source of all of its waters. Someday I will walk these trails with my children and teach them to reimagine forests as communities of complexity and depth and expansiveness, communities that are fated to change, to celebrate both the miracle of life and the miracle of death. Someday I will kneel beside these stumps, a young forest blooming around me, and teach my children the imperfect truth of what it means to love a forest. Someday I will teach my children that this world is not ours to hold, but that we hold it anyway. That each of us is a steward for one brief and precious moment in time. Someday I will teach my children that despite everything, we are destined to thrive, that we are destined to live in a world that is beautiful. We owe too much to the future to be imprisoned by the past. As the storm passes over me, I'm grateful to be anything at all, grateful to be alive at a time when there is so much worth saving. I want to live in a world that will arise from this moment, the world built by people who are brave and resilient, who make countless bittersweet compromises, who live their lives with the dream of a better world burning in their chests. I want to live in a world that will be created by people planting acorns in the rain. Sometimes this life feels like autumn, the exhausted end of a boundless summer. Today I choose to live in a world in which spring is just breaking, a world that is just awakening, just beginning to discover what it truly is. I look toward the broken ridge of the mountain and feel a powerful nostalgia, not for the past, but for the future. High above the storm, the light is swelling, calling everything upward toward a world that is just beginning. Thank you. And now I would love to take some of your questions.
Thank you. We can go ahead and start with the one question that's in the chat so far, which I think is a good one. Have you thought about succession planning for your forest once you are gone? You mentioned that protection is just the beginning and
That's
stewardship is
right.
forever, but you may not be forever. So what
Yes.
happens?
Yeah, and this is so I'm sure that this is true where you are as well. What we call forest succession planning is a big topic because we're recognizing that uh, forest landowners demographically are older, right? And what we see is that as that land gets transferred between generations, a lot of it gets lost. And there's a million different reasons why, but one of the ones I see the most is uh, children that maybe don't have as strong a relationship with it as their parents do, and then can't agree what to do with it. But what they can't agree with to do is to sell it and split the money. And it's just a lot of these places, people have taken care of for a long time, and they deserve to be protected. So I don't have a specific plan for exactly what's going to happen with my land when I'm gone. But I did do one thing that makes me feel a lot better about it, which is that I donated a conservation easement on the land. So a conservation easement, just assuming that we don't all know what that means. Conservation can mean a couple different things. So we think about it as like uppercase C conservation and like lowercase c conservation. Lowercase c conservation is everything that we do to care for and to protect ecosystems. So we are conserving them if we're in some way protecting them and in some way caring for them. But then there's also a more specific definition, which we could call uppercase C conservation, which is where we're protecting them with a conservation easement. So what I did was I gave away many rights that I held, such as the right to subdivide my land, to develop my land, to manage it sort of wantonly or irresponsibly, to mine it. And I gave those to a local land trust, and they hold them in perpetuity. So there is now, I do not have the legal ability to develop my land, nor will anybody else in forever, or as close to forever as we can think about. But as you mentioned, like that is really just the beginning. Like I work with landowners, I work with land trusts all the time, and it's funny because it's like it's really easy for them. It's nothing's easy in conservation, but it's relatively easy for them to raise money to like acquire a parcel of land or to conserve a parcel of land, to put a conservation easement on a parcel of land, especially if it's the perception is that it's at risk or it's has these special cultural or ecological values. And then the part that's really hard is all the other stuff, this process of stewardship, actually like raising money to do the things that are necessary to then help that forest be the most itself. And so what my goal would be that I will be setting up a plan for not just how, not just to physically protect the forest, but a plan for where it will go, like who will take on that stewardship role. And the ultimate would be to have some sort of a stewardship endowment, right? That would a fund that carries with the property that allows whoever holds that land to have the means to actually do that work of caring for it. But there are also, for folks who are wondering about this, there's a lot of different organizations that are offering assistance with forest succession planning. Not every option is as permanent, which can be a little scary, as a conservation easement. So there are different options about putting the land into different ownership structures, for instance, that can protect a lot of these values and and safeguard the land without having to be like you're permanently donating away those development rights, which can feel like a really big deal and a scary thing.
Yeah, I think a lot about all these things on the land that we own, and it's interesting to think about like a stewardship endowment in the context of a privately held piece of land. That's a cool idea. Um, let's see, we have another question here from Ren. In your experience, what role does water play in shaping the resilience of a forest ecosystem, and how can humans work with that rather than against the water?
Mm. Yeah, water. It's an amazing thing. I think about it all the time. One of the things that uh, I find myself thinking about the most is like watersheds. I'm just really interested in them. Every forest management plan that I write, I am in no way required to do this. I just do it, which is a watershed analysis. I like people to know where the water is coming from and where it's going on their land. And it's an amazing thing. Like it's something that our forests need and something that they also provide us. And and there are some pretty simple management practices that will vary slightly depending on where you are to protect water quality. One is buffering stream channels, right? Like providing these buffers, physical buffers around streams that allow that water to be physically protected and also the temperature to be protected so it doesn't get too hot, which is a makes it very hard for a lot of our aquatic organisms to live there, and also provides the habitats that we need adjacent to those water bodies that are really important travel corridors for all kinds of different critters, and also for some of our like our amphibians and reptiles. They need that sort of like adjacent habitat. So buffering that is really important. I think a lot about leaving deadwood on the ground. Like I know that there's some nuance to that where you're in areas that are fire prone, in areas that we have to worry about wildfire and fuel reduction and fuel management. I know that west of the Cascades, as here in Vermont, deadwood on the ground is this like foundational component to forest ecology, right? It is a vital habitat to literally thousands of species of living things. And one of the other things that it does is it benefits building soils and retaining soils by regulating forest hydrology. So what a piece of deadwood can do, like on a slope, for instance, let's say there's a piece of deadwood that's going across the slope, as water runs down that hillside, instead of building up all this power, all this velocity, and all this, momentum, which can cause it to dislodge soil particles, cause erosion, and cause soil loss from that hillside, it hits this piece of dead wood and it spreads it out. It soaks it up as it rots, and it helps it infiltrate into the soil. So going from being surface water to subsurface flow, which are all really important things. And we humans also tend to concentrate water. So like wherever we have a trail or a road, we capture that water and we tend to concentrate it. So it's really important that then when that water is discharged from a road or a trail or a ditch or whatever, that we then spread it back out so that it can be everywhere across the landscape rather than in these like big supercharged flows. So an example of this that you'll see is like when there's a road, you'll have a lot of times on the road, like the way that roads are engineered, the uphill side of the road will have a ditch, right? And that ditch captures all the water, all the subsurface and surface water that's flowing down a hillside above that road, and it concentrates it into that ditch, and that ditch flows into a culvert. So suddenly you'll have a whole hillside of water that's concentrated into a pipe this big, and it's like, just collecting it and giving it all of this momentum that then needs to be dispersed, or else it can cause all this erosion and also just not be available to all of these other tree species that need that subsurface and surface water. So there's also, in addition to being practices in the forest, like retaining those stream buffers, doing a better job, retaining some tree cover in a lot of these areas. There's also some practices like putting water bars in forest roads and trails, eliminating or reducing the ditching distance, so cross draining water on our roads and trails more frequently, and having our ditches be shorter so they're concentrating that water less, stuff like that.
Thank you. Um, let's see, I want to jump from water to fire. It seems like a
Mm.
fitting pivot maybe. We certainly think about fire a lot where we are. And we had a question from Craig that was, yeah, curious about the fire history and forecast for your forest. And I know there are differences,
Yeah.
but I think still, yeah, relevant curiosity there.
You know what has been really interesting is that over the last year, I've gotten to like travel to do talks all over the country, and um, to see like so for me coming from Vermont, fire is not something that we think about. We don't have that many fire adapted ecosystems. It's just not part of our world at all. And and then you travel all over the country. Like I was in over the last month and a half, I've been in like southern Indiana, Kentucky, Mississippi, northern Ontario, which are all places that there have been thousands of years of indigenous fire and natural fire, right? um, and just realizing what an important part of our landscape and our ecology and a lot of this continent that fire is in a way that I think I hadn't realized just practicing as a forester in Vermont. So an example of this that blows my mind is when I was in southern Indiana and Kentucky. You're in these areas and it's just forests, right? Closed canopy forests of these big tall trees. And for the most part, in those areas, that wasn't forest at all, until like the last couple hundred years, because what it was for thousands of years was prairie and oak savannas and oak woodlands, these open canopy oak forests that were maintained by indigenous fire, by natural fire, and by these herds of hundreds of millions of bison, right? And with the displacement of that indigenous fire and the suppression of that natural fire and the loss of those mega herds of bison, these became these closed canopy forests. And so now what they have to do to really restore that ecology is to cut almost all the trees, uh, to like control the deer overpopulation, to control the introduced invasive plants, and to burn them. And that any one part of that by itself would be such a hard sell, right, to general public. And it's really what's necessary to actually restore those forests. And so, I think we need to recognize with fire and I again. So this is me being like, I don't live in an area where this is what we do in forestry. One thing that I'm very interested in, let's just say that, is understanding ways that we can parse the difference between being scared about these mega scary wildfires and the ecological benefits of some fire on the landscape, right? So a big thing in a lot of these areas, and it was the same in Mississippi where I just was. A big thing is like they want and they need some fire, right? In order to provide habitat for the full complement of native species that live there. All of these amazing understory plants, native grasses, these beautiful wildflowers, and all of the species that rely on those. And so one of the things that's about this moment is like everybody's freaked out for good reason about these mega wildfires, and the fire risk is exacerbated by novel conditions. These mega droughts that we get and these crazy high temperatures that we have now, and all of these other things. And managing that stuff is real, and we need to think about that. But I also know that if we get ourselves into a situation where we are losing fire from the landscape because we're so scared of fire and not finding places where we can do this, apply fire to the landscape in the right way, we're going to lose all of these habitats and all of these qualities that are really essential to forests, and to other ecosystems just sort of being themselves.
That made me think of a question that came up for me as we were cruising through the presentation, which is this question of ecological baselines, right? That if we're in the business of restoring a forest, how do sort of what is your tactic for deciding what you're restoring it to, while also knowing that the future looks different than the past?
Yeah,
Yeah, what does that dance look like for you
I
between?
think I think that this is the key. Like this is one of the reasons why it's really important that we get a lot more granular with what we're trying to accomplish, right? So, a lot of times people will be like, we don't have any certainty about what the future is, and so we just need to you know, move these forests north, or we need to, do all of these different actions, or just give up, or whatever. And I think that when we actually look more closely at these forests, like let's actually think about the actual species that live here, right? The actual organisms that rely on these forests as they have for thousands of years, the actual structures and the natural processes that support them, and think about how we can, sustain those things, which really are what a forest is. More so than like these trees that are here in this moment, those structures, those patterns, those processes, those organisms, this thing that we call biodiversity, that is what a forest is. And so the ways that these novel conditions affect ecosystems will not be anything that's like it's going to apply evenly to every species and every process and every forest everywhere. It's very, very nuanced. And so, and manifests in also in different ways at different times, in different parts of the country, etc. So like what I try to do is I just think about it's our just responsibility to hold this thing, which we call a forest, which is changing. And the way that we do that is just by being flexible, but also understanding that our goal is that we're not holding this really like amorphous, impossible to imagine thing. We're actually like holding all of these different species and all of these like specific natural processes and all of these specific qualities, and it's our job to like figure out how to do that, how to sustain those things in light of these novel conditions. We do, and at the same time, we can look at like some of these historical baselines, like our old growth forests as they have been, and understand that there is not going to be a one-to-one of like our forest is never going to look exactly like that again. But that also doesn't mean that baseline is irrelevant, right? That like there are components of that baseline that we need to not throw away because the conditions that we find like in those old growth forests and those old growth ecosystems are the conditions that all of our native species adapted to for millennia, right? They're like what it has meant to be a forest here for thousands of years. And so we need to really actually try to sustain those things as much as we can while also understanding that things are changing. But it's complicated. And honestly, like the answer that I often give to that question is like, we do our best while knowing that we have imperfect information and constantly changing conditions, and we are imperfect stewards, and we do our best. We fail all the time, and then we proceed, and we do our best.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and I suppose the introduction or reintroduction of complexity hopefully leads to some higher level of resilience through change.
Totally.
Let's see. So let's do two more quick questions. One is about actual harvest from the forest. And so someone's curious, what kind of forest harvest do you think is sort of acceptable? Which is a loaded question. So I'm glad that you're on the other side of the country because your answers maybe, won't be too scary.
Oh yeah, and also I'll tell you what, like when I go to the West Coast, I am like, wow, this is really heavy-handed management. So like, it's just a different it's a different ecological context, and it's also just like a different cultural context. And I'm not someone who's like, looks at these sort of more industrial forests and I'm like, ugh, gross, this is awful, you should stop doing that. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that. But I think there are ways to like a lot of the harvest that I do, you would think of as a selective harvest, right? So I've never cut all the trees on an area bigger than about 2 acres. And what we're using entirely natural regeneration. So we're just creating these disturbances that model natural disturbances and then allowing the forest to regenerate naturally. So we're not replanting, we're allowing a full complement of these like native species to reestablish there. And almost all the work I do is implicitly or explicitly trying to create forests that are more like old growth forests, that have these qualities of complexity, this multi-generational structure, many different sizes and ages of trees. I leave these big legacy trees that are retained forever, that are just these like, their whole job is to just be big old trees and to live a full and fruitful life and to never be harvested, and leave tons of dead wood on the ground. That's what it looks like, and it works, like we have, but part of that is also like we have markets that allow us to like cut trees in that way and to make that commercial, which is we're producing this local renewable resource in this way that we're really proud of. And that also allows the work to be done without landowners having to like pay for it all, which is really, really important. We have markets that sustain it. We have loggers that have equipment that's appropriate for that kind of harvest. And I know that in other parts of the country, it's different. So like in my view, I think it's the way that I think about it is we often talk about it in terms of like the triad of different forest types and ways of managing forests that we need to sustain all of our cultural, economic, and ecological needs for forests. So there's 3 different types. One type is industrial forests. These are forests that are not providing all of the values of like a real intact forest ecosystem. They may be just one species of tree or hopefully several species of tree. And they're being managed for that resource, which, by the way, renewable resources have global ecological and human rights benefits. And that is really, really important. So that's one side of the triad, is these industrial forests, trees managed like a crop, which we actually probably want more wood, not less, by the way, more renewable resources, not less. In the middle, or I should say on the other side, we have these unmanaged reserves. So unmanaged reserves, it's something that we all want. All of us who love forests, we want all forests to be unmanaged reserves. Actually, it's not responsible for every forest to be an unmanaged reserve, even for ecological reasons. When you think about these issues that forests face, it's not like a silver bullet that's going to make every forest healthy necessarily at this moment in time. But unmanaged reserves are providing some pretty unique ecological, where they're selected appropriately, pretty unique ecological and social benefits, cultural benefits. And then in the middle, we have this other thing, which is where I operate, which is these forests that are managed sometimes for timber, for forest products, in a way that's appropriate, but also for recreation, for biodiversity protection, for wildlife habitat, for water quality, for all of these other things, right? It's this big, expansive middle area where we have an active relationship with ecosystems, but we're also not treating them like a commodity, right? So the interesting thing about these 3 categories, we'll call this one industrial forest, this one reserves, and this one, I don't know, middle category, is that these 3 categories are actually in relationship with each other, and we need all of them. So if, for instance, if you want fewer industrial forests, you also can have probably fewer reserves, and you need more of this middle category. If you want more reserves, you need more industrial forests and less of this middle category, right? And so it's really like, I think when we think about what's appropriate to harvest, it depends on like the context, but I am an advocate for harvesting wood because I think it's an amazing resource. Then it's just about how we harvest it right. And the one thing that I'll say too is that every time I'm like a little bit critical of industrial forest management, as I am, by the way, of passive management, which is putting forest in reserves, because I just feel like we often don't think hard enough about when we do that. When I get criticized for criticizing this industrial forest management, which in my view is often more heavy-handed than it needs to be, what I'll say is that sometimes we get confused about what is actually necessary and what is just what we're used to, right? There are ways to, for instance, to reform industrial forest management to make it more ecologically friendly while still capturing all of the values and all of the different things that have been built up around it. You know, the loggers as they're used to working and the mills that are used to taking this certain kind of wood. It would be, it wouldn't be nothing, but it would be possible to do. Yeah, that's what I would say about that. But I'm not an opponent of industrial forest management per se.
All right, and then I think the one to end on is so we talked about protecting the forest, we talked about managing the forest, stewarding it, and then we had a question about ways to get the youth involved in forestry and engaged with forests, which feels like a natural sort of, yeah, what is the
Yeah.
future look like for the new stewardship generation?
Yeah, I mean, I've been on this a little bit of an adventure in this respect in the part of my life that is social media, right, which is a bigger and bigger part of my life all the time. And I actually had an interesting experience of, since I've been out on the road talking about how to love a forest and reading from it and all this other stuff, of having all these awesome interactions with all these folks that are like in their late teens and early 20s. And I really think what it is that there's a whole generation of people in this world that, their whole lives, they have been raised with this awareness of climate change and these environmental catastrophes and inundated with this stuff all the time. And they're kind of like, the ones that I've met and talked to have been sort of like, enough. Stop telling us that this is happening and tell us what we're going to do about it. And they have been like, that has been really cool to see that. But, in order to bring new generations of people on board, like we need to be where they are. And so that's the thing I'm thinking about with the social media thing, is I'm like, we can't, assume that we can make a paper pamphlet, and someone who's 19 is gonna, go and pick it up somewhere physically. Like, we need to be understanding that, like, it's our responsibility to try and build this culture, and we're not going to do that unless we're actually like reaching out to people where they are. And so a big part of my communication work has been trying to communicate in different places, so like using the social media as a tool to like bring different kinds of people on board with our kind of conservation coalition, and then also to kind of talk about this stuff in a little bit of a different way. And if you read the book, if you watch my social media, see that it's not all me just like regurgitating science. I'm also talking about things like feelings, what it feels like, to be in this world and to be dealing with all of this stuff, and what it feels like to be responsible for these ecosystems and to be caring for them. And in my view, when we talk about these things in a different way, we engage different people. And to me, being willing to sort of make these like emotional arguments, to hold this emotional quality of this world that we live in, at the same time that we hold this like scientific, dry, objective reality, is very, very important to reaching out to new people.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great note to finish on. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us from afar and sharing your perspective with us. We really appreciate it.
Truly my pleasure. And have a good night, everybody. I don't even know. I'm up late for me, so who knows what could happen now. Maybe I'll just go to the casino.
There you
It'll be
go.
a bit of a drive.
Well, have fun whatever you do. Asleep in 5 minutes, probably. That sounds pretty
That's
good.
right. Good
Good night,
night.
everybody.